There's a kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with flowers or poetry or grand declarations. It shows up quiet, in calloused hands, and coffee left warming on the stove. I have been thinking about that lately, how we spend half our lives chasing what we think love should look like, only to find it wearing work boots and silence. This story is about a young woman who crossed 2,000 miles looking for adventure and found something harder to recognize but far more lasting. It's a simple tale, really. The kind our grandmothers might have told, if we'd thought to ask. The stagecoach door swung open and dust rolled in like a living thing. Clara Ashford gripped her traveling case and stepped down into the hard noon light of Sagebrush Hollow. Mother-of-pearl buttons, dove-gray silk. She looked like a woman who had taken a wrong turn somewhere around Kansas and kept going anyway. She scanned the boardwalk, weathered faces, calico bonnets, a dog scratching itself in a patch of shade. No one came forward. She had memorized his photograph. Square jaw, steady eyes. The letter had said he would be waiting. The letter had said a great many things. A man emerged from the shadow of the general store. Tall, sun-darkened, hat pulled low. He walked toward her without hurrying, stopped 3 feet away, and looked at her trunk. "Miss Ashford." "Yes. You must be—" He picked up the trunk, turned, started walking toward a buckboard wagon at the end of the street. No handshake, no smile, no tip of the hat. Clara stood alone in the settling dust, her gloved hand still half extended toward nothing at all. From our channel data, nearly 60% of viewers haven't yet subscribed or liked this story. If this tale has touched something familiar in your heart, we'd be grateful for your support. It helps us bring more stories like this to folks who appreciate them. Thank you kindly for being here. 6 hours on that wagon. Clara's back ached against the wooden seat. Her throat had gone dry somewhere around mile 10, but she hadn't asked for water. The canvas bag hung from a hook near his elbow. He hadn't offered. She tried conversation. Twice, 3 times. His answers came in grunts and single syllables. After the 4th attempt, she stopped trying. The sun crawled across the sky and sank behind the western hills. The ranch house appeared in the purple dusk, 4 walls, a tin roof, a porch with 1 rocking chair. Silas carried her trunk inside without a word. The door creaked. Clara stepped through and stopped. A cast-iron stove, a table made of rough-hewn planks, 2 chairs that didn't match, bare walls, bare windows. No curtains, no pictures, no flowers. The whole place smelled of wood smoke and something else, emptiness. Maybe. The kind that seeps into floorboards when a house goes too long without laughter. She unpacked slowly. Silk ribbons, a silver hand mirror, a leather-bound volume of Tennyson's poems. She set the mirror on the windowsill, and it caught the last light, threw a bright square onto the bare wall behind her. It looked ridiculous, all of it, like costume jewelry on a corpse. Silas appeared in the doorway. He pointed toward a narrow room off the main space. "Bedroom's there. I'll take the barn. Till—" He rubbed the back of his neck. Until the door closed behind him. Clara made dinner, beans, biscuits. She burned both. The beans stuck to the bottom of the pot in a blackened crust. The biscuits came out heavy as river stones. She set his plate down, watched him eat, every bite, no wince, no comment. "Thank you," he said when the plate was clean. 2 words. Then the scrape of his chair, the clink of his plate in the wash basin, the door opening, closing, gone. Clara sat alone at the table. The coal oil lamp hissed and flickered. Shadows pressed in from every corner. She counted the knotholes in the wood. 7. She counted them again. Outside. A faint yellow glow appeared in the barn window. He was still awake. 20 feet away, she pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and stared at that distant light until her hand went numb. What kind of man eats burned beans without flinching, but can't look his wife in the eye? Days bled into each other. Clara woke each morning to the smell of coffee already made. The stove warm, the front door open to let in the cool dawn air. Silas was always gone by the time her feet touched the cold floorboards. She watched him through the window, mending the split-rail fence along the north pasture, hauling water from the creek in wooden buckets that left dark, wet trails in the dust, checking the hooves of the bay mare, one leg at a time. Patient as stone, he moved with the easy rhythm of a man who had done these things alone for years. No wasted motion, no hesitation. She noticed his hands, large, calloused, the knuckles scarred and sun-darkened. They handled tools the way other men handled playing cards, certain, quick, familiar. One morning, a commotion in the corral pulled her to the porch. A young colt chestnut, maybe a yearling, paced the fence line, wild-eyed, ears flat. It kicked at the rails when Clara stepped closer, and she stopped. Silas came around the corner of the barn. He didn't look at her. He opened the corral gate and stepped inside. No rope in his hands, no whip, nothing. He stood still, palms open at his sides. The colt snorted and circled. Hooves threw up little clouds of dust. It swung its head, showing the whites of its eyes. Silas didn't move. The colt circled again, slower this time. Its ears flicked forward, then back, forward again. As Silas waited, minutes passed. Clara's fingers tightened on the porch rail. The morning sun climbed higher. Somewhere behind the barn, a rooster crowed twice. The colt stopped. It stood 10 feet from Silas, sides heaving, nostrils flared. Then one step, another. It stretched its neck toward him, muscles quivering under the dusty coat. Silas raised one hand, slow, like he was reaching through water. His palm found the colt's neck. He stroked once, twice. The colt's head dropped. Its whole body seemed to exhale. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Those hands, the same hands that hadn't touched her once since she arrived, rough as old bark against that trembling neck, gentle as anything she had ever seen. The next morning, she didn't wait at the window. She found a bucket by the henhouse door and picked it up. Silas looked at her, looked at the bucket. His eyebrows rose a quarter inch, the most expression she'd seen from him in 2 weeks. He took the bucket from her hands, showed her how to hold it low against her hip so the chickens couldn't knock it over when they rushed for the feed. He didn't lecture, didn't sigh, just moved her hands into position and stepped back. The feed trough came next. She learned to check for rust along the bottom edge, where water pooled and rotted the metal. The hand pump required 3 hard pulls before the water ran clear. The sky told you things if you learned to read it. Clouds stacking in the west meant rain by nightfall. Clouds moving fast and flat meant wind and nothing else. Silas taught all of it without words. A nod when she got it right. A shake of the head when she didn't. He never grabbed the tool from her hands, never rolled his eyes, just waited while she figured it out. Then moved on to the next thing. Her palms blistered, then calloused. The blisters hurt. The calluses didn't. By the end of the second week, Her biscuits had stopped resembling river stones. Silas took seconds one evening. Didn't comment on it, but he took them. One evening. Clara came inside to start supper and stopped in the doorway. Wildflowers sat on the kitchen table, purple sage, yellow columbine. Dirt still clung to the roots. The stems were wrapped in wet burlap and leaned against the salt cellar. No note, no ribbon, just flowers, plain and simple. Like someone had pulled them from the earth 5 minutes ago. The barn door was already closed, the lamp inside already lit. Clara crossed to the table, touched one petal with her fingertip. Soft. Still cool from the shade where it had grown. Her mother's voice rose unbidden from somewhere deep. Watch what a man does, child. Any fool can talk pretty. She found a tin cup in the cupboard, filled it with water from the pump, arranged the flowers inside clumsy. The stems too long, the cup too narrow, and set it on the windowsill where the morning light would find them. Then she sat down at the table with paper and pen. She wrote a letter to her sister back in New York. 4 pages. She told Catherine about the journey, the dust, the silence, the man who communicated in coffee and crooked curtains and wildflowers wrapped in burlap. She folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, wrote the address in her careful hand. She didn't mail it. The letter sat on the shelf beside her volume of Tennyson for 3 days, then a week. She looked at it sometime, picked it up, put it down. If she mailed it, Catherine would write back. Catherine would ask questions. Catherine would want to know if Clara was happy, if this had been a mistake, if she wanted to come home. Clara didn't know how to answer any of those questions yet. She was learning a new language. The vocabulary was strange buckets and blisters and purple sage in a tin cup, but she was starting to recognize the grammar. The morning of the 3rd week. Clara awoke before dawn. She dressed in the dark, pulled on the work boots she had bought in town, ugly things, brown leather, practical, and walked out to the corral. Silas was already there, brushing down the bay mare. He looked up when she approached, looked at the boots, back at her face. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, but close. Closer than anything she'd seen before. He held out the brush. She took it. Their fingers touched for half a second, rough against rough, callous against callous, and then he stepped back and let her work. Behind them, the sun broke over the eastern ridge. The light hit the barn roof first, then the corral fence, then the mare's chestnut coat. Clara ran the brush down the horse's flank and felt the animal lean into the pressure. She didn't hear him leave, but when she turned around, Silas was gone. The barn door stood open, and on the fence post nearest her, placed where she couldn't miss it, sat a pair of worn leather work gloves. They were too big for her hands. She put them on anyway. The rhythm came slowly. Clara learned to wake before full light, learned the creak of the 3rd floorboard, the one that groaned if you stepped on it wrong. Learned to move quiet through the dark kitchen, feeling for the coffee pot, the tin cups, the box of matches beside the stove. Silas still rose earlier, but now, when she came outside with her cup warming her palms, he nodded. Once, brief. Then went back to whatever task he'd started. By the 6th week, she could read his silences the way she once read sheet music. The short grunt meant good. The longer exhale through his nose meant not quite. A single shake of his head, small, almost invisible, meant stop before you hurt yourself. And the rare nod, The one that came with eye contact meant something close to praise. She learned to read the land, too. Which pasture caught the morning shade and held it longest? Where the creek ran shallow enough to cross without soaking her boots? How the cattle bunched together before a storm, heads low, tails to the wind. Mornings belonged to the henhouse and the butter churn. The dasher moved up and down in her grip, pull and release until her shoulders burned and the cream finally thickened into pale yellow clumps. Afternoons, she worked wherever Silas worked. Not in his way, just nearby, handing him nails when he mended the barn door, holding the mare's bridle while he checked her shoes, learning the weight of silence that wasn't empty. Suppers changed. Still quiet. But Silas looked up now when she set his plate down, met her eyes for half a second before dropping his gaze to the food. He took seconds on her biscuits without being asked. Once, she caught him scraping the last of her gravy from the plate with a torn piece of bread. He didn't say anything about it, but he scraped the plate clean. The wagon appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 weeks and 3 days after Clara had stepped off that stagecoach in Sagebrush Hollow. She heard it before she saw it, the rattle of wheels on the dirt track, the jingle of harness brass. She stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. A woman sat on the wagon seat, round face, gray hair pulled back under a faded bonnet. She waved one arm over her head like she was flagging down a runaway train. "Hello there, you must be the new Mrs. Drifter." Clara's hand found the porch rail. She hadn't thought of herself that way. Not yet. The woman climbed down from the wagon with surprising speed for her size. A man followed, tall, thin as a fence rail, moving slow and careful, like his joints pained him. Martha Holloway. The woman took Clara's hand in both of hers and pumped it twice. "And that's Ezra. Don't mind him, he don't talk much." She leaned closer, dropped her voice to a stage whisper. "Seems like you got the same problem around here." "I'm Clara. Please, come inside. I'll make coffee." Martha Holloway talked enough for 4 people. She settled into one of the kitchen chairs like she'd been sitting there for years. Her eyes moved around the room, taking in the wildflowers on the windowsill, the curtains that still weren't there, the bare walls that Clara hadn't figured out how to soften. "Lord have mercy," Martha said. "This place needs a woman's touch, something fierce." She patted Clara's arm. "Good thing you showed up when you did." Ezra sat by the stove and said nothing. His eyes were kind. He nodded at Clara once, then seemed content to let his wife carry the conversation. Martha did plenty. The community held church gatherings once a month at the Fenton place, 8 miles south. Barn raisings happened whenever someone needed one, and someone always needed one. Mrs. Patterson made the best apple pie in 3 counties, but wouldn't share her recipe with anybody, not even on her deathbed, which was a sin and a shame. "Folks look out for each other here," Martha said. "Have to. The nearest real town is 40 miles. Its nearest doctor is 60. You get in trouble out here. It's your neighbors who save you or nobody at all." Clara poured more coffee. "How long have you known Silas?" Martha's face changed, softened around the edges. "Since he was a boy running barefoot through these fields. Watched him grow up on this land." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "His folks were good people, Henry and Ruth, salt of the earth, both of them. Fever took 'em, 3 years back. Came through the whole valley that summer. But it hit this ranch hardest." Martha shook her head slowly. "Ruth went first. Henry followed 4 days later. Couldn't live without her, I reckon. Some men are like that." Clara's throat tightened. "Silas never mentioned He wouldn't. Martha set down her cup. Bless his heart. That man wouldn't complain if his boots were on fire. He buried them himself. Both of them. Didn't ask for help. Didn't want it. Just dug the holes under that cottonwood tree out back and got on with living. She paused. If you can call it that. Ezra spoke for the first time. 2 words. Quiet as falling leaves. Good man. Martha nodded. Best kind. Quiet kind. The kind that shows up when you need him and never asks for nothing in return. Her sharp eyes fixed on Clara. I told Ezra when we heard he'd sent for a bride, I said, that girl's got grit or she's got nothing. Looking at you now, sitting here with calluses on your hands and dirt under your fingernails. She smiled. Looks like grit to me. Clara looked down at her hands. Martha was right. The calluses had thickened. The skin had darkened from sun. These weren't the hands of a woman who had danced at cotillion balls and worn silk gloves to afternoon tea. You want my advice? Martha leaned forward. Don't try to fix him. Just stand next to him long enough he'll fix himself. They left an hour later. Martha hugged Clara like they'd known each other for decades. Ezra shook her hand once, firm and brief, and said nothing more. You need anything, Martha called from the wagon seat. You send word. We're 5 miles east, just past the creek with the bent cottonwood. Clara watched them go. The dust settled behind the wagon wheels. The afternoon sun slanted low across the empty yard. She stood there for a long time, thinking about a young man digging 2 graves alone, filling them alone and walking back to an empty house alone. 3 years of silence. 3 years of eating meals at a table built for 2 with only 1 chair filled. That evening, Clara made coffee. Strong, black, and the way he drank it. She carried the cup across the yard. The barn door stood open. Lantern light spilled onto the packed dirt. She could hear him inside the steady scrape of a brush against horsehide, the soft sound of the mare shifting her weight. Clara stepped through the doorway. Silas looked up. The brush stopped mid-stroke. His eyebrows lifted a fraction of an inch. She set the cup on a hay bale near his elbow, turned, started walking back toward the house. His voice stopped her at the door. Clara, just her name. Nothing else, but something in the way he said it, not flat, not empty. Something underneath that she couldn't quite name. She turned her head, but didn't look back. Yes, pause, long enough for the mare to snort and stamp 1 hoof. Coffee's good. Clara nodded once, walked out into the cooling dark, crossed the yard, climbed the porch steps. Her hands were shaking when she reached the kitchen. She pressed them flat against the edge of the stove and stood there, staring at her reflection in the dark window glass. She was smiling. She couldn't remember when she had started. Later that night, lying awake on the corn husk mattress, Clara listened to the silence of the house. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like something waiting to be filled. He had said her name, first time since she'd arrived. She pressed her hand against her chest and felt her heart beating hard beneath her palm. What else was buried under all that quiet? The fever came on a Thursday morning. Clara woke with her head pounding and her skin hot to the touch. She tried to stand. The room tilted sideways. She grabbed the bedpost and held on until the walls stopped moving. Just a cold. Just exhaustion. Her body catching up with weeks of work it wasn't built for. She made it to the kitchen, started the coffee. Her hands shook so badly that ground scattered across the stovetop like black snow. She swept them up with clumsy fingers and tried again. Silas found her slumped against the kitchen table an hour later. She heard his boots on the floorboards, felt his hand rough, warm press against her forehead. He made a sound low in his throat. Not a word. Something more animal than that. Then his arms were under her, lifting, carrying. The ceiling beams passed overhead in slow procession, the bedroom doorway, the corn husk mattress rising up to meet her back. "Stay," he said. One word, an order. She didn't have the strength to argue. The next 4 days blurred together like watercolors left out in the rain. Clara drifted in and out of awareness. Sometimes the room was bright afternoon sun slanting sharp through the bare window. Sometimes it was dark, the coal oil lamp flickering on the bedside table, throwing shadows that jumped and swayed with every gust of wind through the walls. But always, when she opened her eyes, Silas was there, sat in a ladder-back chair pulled close to the bed. His hat was off, his hair brown. Longer than she'd realized fell across his forehead in unwashed tangles. He held a bowl in his hands. Steam rose from it in thin white curls. "Broth," he said. "Drink." She drank. Chicken broth, salty and hot and good. It burned going down, but she didn't care. Her throat had gone so dry she'd forgotten what swallowing felt like. A cool cloth appeared on her forehead. She hadn't seen him dip it in water, hadn't seen him wring it out. But there it was, wet and cold against her burning skin. The relief so sudden it made her eyes sting. When the cloth warmed, he replaced it, again, again, again. Sometime during the first night, Clara woke to the sound of his voice, low, rough, unpracticed. He was reading from a book, leather-bound, the cover worn soft at the corners and cracked along the spine, his mother's Bible. Clara recognized it from the shelf where it had sat untouched since she'd arrived. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read, stumbling over the rhythm. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth." He paused, tried again. "He restoreth my soul." His voice cracked on the last word. He cleared his throat and kept going. Page after page, psalm after psalm. The words washed over Clara like water over river stones, smoothing edges, filling cracks, carrying away things that no longer needed to stay. She closed her eyes and let herself drift. She didn't know if he was reading for her or for himself. It didn't matter. On the morning of the 5th day, the fever broke. Clara opened her eyes to gray dawn light and a clear head. Her body ached like she'd been trampled by horses. But the burning was gone. The room stayed still when she turned her head. The walls didn't tilt. Silas was asleep in the chair. His chin rested on his chest. The Bible lay open in his lap. One hand still pressed flat against the thin pages, as if he'd fallen asleep mid-verse. Dark circles shadowed the skin beneath his eyes. Stubble covered his jaw 4 days' worth, maybe 5. He hadn't left. Not once. Not for chores. Not for meals. Not for sleep that wasn't stolen in a hard wooden chair beside her bed. Clara watched him breathe, in and out, slow and steady. His chest rose and fell beneath the faded cotton of his shirt. Her throat tightened. She turned her face toward the wall and blinked hard until her eyes stopped burning. When she looked back, he was awake, watching her. "Better?" he asked. His voice was rough. scraped raw from reading aloud through 4 long nights. Better, he nodded once, stood. His knees popped loud in the quiet room, the sound of joints too long bent in the same position. He set the Bible on the bedside table and walked out without another word. Clara heard the front door open, heard his boots cross the porch, heard the barn door creak on its hinges. She lay there for a long time, her hand resting on the worn leather cover of his mother's Bible. The next morning, she could stand without the room spinning. She dressed slowly. Every movement cost something. Her legs felt borrowed, weak, unreliable, belonging to someone else. But she made it to the bedroom door, pushed it open, and stopped. Curtains hung at the windows. Rough cotton fabric. Faded blue, like a work shirt washed 100 times. The hems were uneven, clearly cut with shears meant for leather, stitched by hands more used to mending harness than sewing cloth. One panel hung a full inch lower than the other. Clara crossed the room, touched the fabric. It was soft from washing. Someone had washed it before hanging it up. Someone had taken the time to think about that. Her eyes moved to the windowsill. A jar of wildflowers sat there, purple sage and yellow columbine, just like before, fresh ones. The water was still clear. The petals hadn't begun to curl. She turned toward the bedroom. A small shelf had been nailed to the wall beside the headboard. Raw wood, sanded smooth along the edges so it wouldn't catch or splinter, just wide enough for 3 or 4 books. Her volume of Tennyson sat there already, spine facing out, positioned with care. Silas stood in the kitchen doorway. His hands hung at his sides. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the floor, at the dust motes floating in the morning light, at anything except her face. The tips of his ears had gone red. Silas, don't fit right. His voice came out rough, defensive. The curtains, I can take 'em down. Redo 'em if you... They're perfect. He cleared his throat, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, rubbed the back of his neck with one calloused hand. The shelf, too. If it ain't level, I can... It's perfect. He nodded once. Sharp. Quick. Then he turned and walked out. The door banged shut behind him. His boots crossed the porch fast, almost running. Clara stood alone in the kitchen with her hand still pressed against the uneven curtain fabric. Her chest ached not from the fever, from something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with sickness. That evening, they sat at the table together. The coal oil lamp burned low between them. Clara's hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Silas stared at a spot somewhere past her left shoulder, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the tabletop. The silence stretched, but it was different now, full of things pressing to be said. Clara spoke first. Will you tell me about them? Your parents? Silas's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath the stubble on his cheek. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, thought she'd pushed too far, asked for too much, broken something fragile that had only just begun to form. Then, slow and heavy as stone sinking through water, the words came. Pa taught me to work. Pause. The lamp flickered. A moth batted against the glass chimney. Ma taught me to pray. Pause. Longer this time. His fingers stopped drumming. They went quick. That's something. Fever took 'em both inside a week. Some folks linger for months. They didn't. He stopped, swallowed. His Adam's apple moved in his throat. Buried him under the cottonwood, out back. His voice dropped until Clara had to lean forward to hear. Ma liked that tree. Used to sit under it evenings. When the work was done, Dad said the leaves sounded like water running over rocks. He stopped talking. His hands lay flat on the table now, palms down, fingers spread. The knuckles had gone white from pressing. Clara reached across the space between them. Her hand covered his. She felt the calluses, the old scars, the tension running through his tendons like fence wire pulled too tight. He didn't pull away. He didn't squeeze back either. Just stayed. Let her hand rest on his. Let the warmth pass between them in the silence. The lamp burned lower. The shadows grew longer. Outside, a coyote called somewhere in the dark hills. Another answered from farther away. Clara's thumb found the thickest callus on his palm, the ridge at the base of his index finger, built up from years of gripping tools and reins. She traced it slowly, felt the rough edge of skin, the years of work stored there like rings in the heartwood of a tree. Silas's breath caught, just once, barely audible. He turned his hand over slow, careful, like he was handling something that might break until his palm faced up, until her fingers rested in the hollow of his hand. They sat like that until the lamp guttered and died, until the room went full dark, until Clara couldn't see his face anymore, only feel the rough warmth of his skin against hers. When she finally stood to go to bed, he spoke. "Clara." She stopped at the bedroom door. "I ain't—" He paused. Started again. "Words don't come easy for me. Never have. I know. But Another pause. Longer. The darkness hid his face, but not the weight in his voice. "I'm glad you're better." Clara couldn't see him, but she could hear what lived underneath those simple words. What he couldn't say. What he might never find the language to say. "I'm glad too," she whispered. She stepped into the bedroom, closed the door, pressed her back against the rough wood, and stood there in the darkness, her hand still warm from where his fingers had held it. Outside, the wind picked up. The new curtain stirred against the window frame, brushing the glass with a soft sound like breath. And somewhere far to the north beyond the mountains, beyond the high pastures where the wild cattle roamed, thunder rumbled low and long across the horizon. Like a warning, the heat came down like a hammer. Clara woke each morning to air that felt thick enough to chew. The creek behind the barn had shrunk to a muddy trickle. The cattle clustered under the few cottonwoods, sides heaving, too hot to graze. Silas rode out before dawn now, every day. He saddled the bay mare in the dark and headed north toward the ridgeline. Clara watched him go from the porch, coffee cooling in her hands. He came back hours later with dust in the creases of his face and something hard in his eyes. "What are you looking for?" she asked one evening. He stood at the water pump, splashing his face and neck. Water ran down his collar and darkened his shirt. He straightened, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Wild herd. Wild cattle? Gone feral?" He pointed north, toward the mountains that rose blue and distant against the sky. "Abandon spreads up in the high country. Folks left during the bad years. Cattle stayed, bred, went wild." Clara waited. He wasn't finished. "Drought pushes them down. They come looking for water, for grass." He shook his head. The water dripped from his hair onto his shoulders. "If they come through the valley when a storm hits." He stopped. "What happens?" They stampede, 300 head, maybe more. They'll flatten everything in their path. Fences, crops, livestock. He looked at her. Houses. Clara's hand tightened on the porch rail. Can't anyone stop them? Not stop. Turn. He picked up the towel hanging by the pump and dried his face. Somebody'd have to ride into the middle of them. Turn the lead cattle toward the eastern basin. Empty land out there. Nothing to destroy. Somebody. He didn't answer. He walked past her into the house and didn't speak again that night. The signs multiplied over the following days. Dust clouds on the northern horizon. Not wind dust, something heavier. Something that moved with purpose. Clara saw it in the afternoons, a brown smudge against the pale sky. Their own cattle grew restless. They paced the fence line instead of grazing. The milk cow kicked over her pail twice. The chickens wouldn't settle in the henhouse until full dark. Silas rode out one afternoon and came back with his jaw set tight. He unsaddled the mare without speaking, brushed her down without speaking, walked to the porch where Clara stood waiting and stopped at the bottom step. "How many?" she asked. 300, maybe more. "How close?" 2 days, maybe 3. He looked north, though there was nothing to see from here but the low hills and the empty sky. "Storm's coming too. I can smell it." Clara couldn't smell anything but dust and dry grass. But she didn't doubt him. "What do we do? Meeting tomorrow? Holloway Place? Everybody's coming?" He climbed the steps, stopped beside her. For a moment, his hand lifted like he might touch her arm, her shoulder, her face. Then it dropped back to his side. "Make extra biscuits," he said. "We'll bring 'em." The Holloway barn was full. Clara counted 15 people, ranchers and farmers from spreads scattered across the valley. Weathered faces, worried eyes. They stood in clusters between the hay bales and the empty stalls, talking in low voices that stopped when Silas walked in. Martha Holloway pressed a cup of water into Clara's hands. "Lord have mercy," she said. "You'd think the end times were coming, the way these men are carrying on." Ezra stood near the barn door with 2 other men Clara didn't recognize. Their voices carried in the thick air. 300 head, easy, maybe more. Coming down through Miller's Canyon, straight shot to the valley floor. If that storm hits while they're running, won't be nothing left standing. The barn fell quiet. Everyone looked toward the center of the space, where a kerosene lantern hung from a nail, throwing long shadows across the dirt floor. A man Clara didn't know spoke first. Older, gray beard, hands like knotted rope. "We ain't got the men to turn a herd that size, not spread out like we are." Another voice, younger. "What about the eastern basin? If we could push 'em that direction, push 'em, how you gonna ride into a stampede by yourself?" I didn't say, "Ain't nobody here got that many hands. Ain't nobody here got that kind of crazy." The voices rose, overlapped, arguments and counter-arguments and fear underneath all of it. Clara watched Silas. He stood at the edge of the group, arms crossed, face unreadable. He hadn't said a word since they'd arrived. Ezra Holloway raised one hand. The barn went quiet. "I've seen men try to turn a stampede," he said. His voice was calm, flat. "Seen 'em buried, too." Silence. Martha made a sound beside Clara, half sigh, half prayer, as Silas uncrossed his arms. Stepped forward. The lantern light caught his face, and Clara saw something there she hadn't seen before. Not fear. Something older, harder. Resignation. Maybe. I'll do it. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. The gray-bearded man shook his head. By yourself, Silas. I know the canyons. I know how they run. If I can get ahead of them, hit the lead steers before they reach the valley floor, you'll get yourself killed. Silas shrugged, one shoulder. Might. Ezra stepped closer, put one weathered hand on Silas's arm. Son, you ride into that herd alone. You might not ride out. Then I won't get buried. Beat. Aim not to. Anyway, Martha's voice cut across the barn. Lord, that man's got more stubborn in his little finger than most folks got in their whole body. A few people laughed. Short, nervous. The tension cracked, but didn't break. The meeting broke up an hour later. Plans made, contingencies discussed. Everyone knew the truth. It all came down to one man, one horse, and a whole lot of luck. Clara found Silas outside the barn. He was checking the mare's cinch strap, running his hands along the leather like he was already preparing. She grabbed his arm. He stopped, turned. You can't go alone. Her voice came out harder than she intended. There has to be another way. He looked at her. The moonlight caught his eyes and held them. For a moment, something in his face shifted, opened. She saw the fear he'd hidden in the barn, the doubt, the terrible weight of what he'd volunteered to do. Somebody has to, he said. Then let it be somebody else. There ain't nobody else. He pulled his arm free, gentle but firm. This is what I do, Clara. This is what I've always done. Look after folks. Keep 'em safe. He paused. Only difference now is, I got something to come back to. He walked to his horse, mounted, looked down at her from the saddle. Storm hits tomorrow night, maybe the night after. He gathered the reins. I'll be back. That's a promise. He rode off into the dark. Clara stood in the Holloway yard and watched until she couldn't see him anymore, until the sound of hoofbeats faded to nothing. Martha appeared beside her, pressed something into her hand, a handkerchief. Clara hadn't realized she was crying. Come inside, child, Martha said. Nothing to do now but wait and pray. Clara looked north. The stars were disappearing behind clouds she couldn't see. The air had changed heavier, charged, like the sky was holding its breath. Somewhere beyond those clouds, 300 head of wild cattle were moving toward the valley. And somewhere between here and there, her husband was riding alone into the dark. The storm hit at dusk. Clara stood at the window and watched the sky turn green, then black. Lightning split the horizon in jagged white lines. Thunder followed not distant rumbles, but full-body crashes that shook dust from the rafters and rattled the glass in its frame. Rain came next, not gentle, not gradual. A wall of water that slammed against the house like something alive and angry. The windows shuddered. The new curtain, Silas's crooked curtain, swayed in the draft that crept through every crack and seam. He had left an hour ago. She had watched him saddle the mare in the strange green light before the storm broke. Watched him check the cinch strap twice, 3 times, watched him swing up into the saddle and turn the horse north without looking back. She had wanted to run after him, grab the reins, beg him not to go. She hadn't moved from the porch. Now she pressed her forehead against the cold glass and stared into the chaos. Rain streamed down the window in sheets so thick she couldn't see the barn, couldn't see the corral, couldn't see anything except water and darkness and the occasional flash of white light that burned shapes into her eyes for seconds after it faded. The clock on the mantel ticked. Slow, steady, relentless. Wrapped both hands around a coffee cup that had gone cold hours ago. She thought about New York, the brownstone on Lexington Avenue, her bedroom with the rose-patterned wallpaper, and lace curtains her mother had ordered from France. The suitors who came calling on Sunday afternoons, young men in pressed suits, with practiced smiles and rehearsed compliments. "Miss Ashford, you look divine this evening. Miss Ashford, might I have this dance? Words, pretty words, smooth words, words that slid off the tongue like oil and meant exactly nothing. None of those men would ride into a storm for strangers. None of them would risk their lives for neighbors they barely knew. None of them would lift a finger for anything that might wrinkle their fine linen shirts or scuff their polished boots. Lightning flashed. Thunder cracked so loud the walls shook and the lamp chimney rattled against its base. Clara flinched. Coffee sloshed over the rim of her cup and pooled on the table in a dark, spreading stain. She didn't wipe it up. The clock ticked. 9 o'clock. 10. 11. Clara tried to pray. The words came out wrong fragments. Broken pieces of hymns half-remembered from childhood Sundays in the family pew. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not." Thunder drowned out the rest. The whole house shook. She started again. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow, lightning." Close. The whole room turned white for a heartbeat, then plunged back into darkness. The shadow of... She couldn't remember what came next. The words scattered and wouldn't come back. Midnight. The storm showed no sign of breaking. Clara stood. Her legs had gone stiff from sitting. She walked to the window, back to the table, to the window again. Her boots made wet sounds on the floorboard she had tracked mud inside earlier without noticing. She picked up the coffee cup, set it down, picked it up again. She counted the knotholes in the table. 7, same as always, the same as the first night she had sat here alone wondering what kind of man she had married. She counted them again. 7, 1 o'clock, 2. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She pressed them flat against the table. They shook anyway. She pressed them against her thighs. Her legs shook too. She thought about the wild herd. 300 cattle, maybe more, running blind through the storm, hooves like thunder on the canyon floor, eyes rolling white with terror. She thought about Silas riding into the middle of them. 1 man, 1 horse, a coat to wave, and a voice to shout, and nothing else between him and all that crushing weight. She thought about hooves, about falling, about the mud churned up by hundreds of panicked animals. Her stomach heaved. She made it to the door, got it open, made it to the edge of the porch before her knees buckled and everything came up. She vomited into the rain, coffee and bile and nothing else she hadn't eaten since morning. Her body heaved again, until there was nothing left, and she was just retching air, her whole torso convulsing with the effort. Rain soaked through her dress in seconds. Her hair plastered against her face and neck. Water ran into her eyes and her mouth, and she couldn't tell anymore if she was crying or if it was just the storm taking her apart piece by piece. She tried to stand. Her foot slipped on the wet boards. She went down hard. Knees first, then hands, then the rest of her sliding off the edge of the porch, tumbling into the mud below. The mud was cold, thick, black in the darkness. It swallowed her hands to the wrists when she tried to catch herself. It soaked through her skirt and her petticoats and pressed against her skin like something hungry. Clara tried to push herself up. Her arm shook, gave out. Her face hit the mud, her cheek, her mouth, the grit thick and foul against her lips. She lay there. The rain hammered her back. The mud sucked at her clothes, her hair, her skin. She could feel it seeping through to places mud had no business being, coating her, claiming her. She was Clara Ashford of the New York Ashfords. She had been presented a cotillion. She had danced with senators' sons and railroad heirs. She had worn silk gloves and pearl earrings and dresses that cost more than most families earned in a year. Now she lay face down in the mud behind a ranch house in the middle of nowhere, covered in filth, sobbing like a child, unable to stand, unable to stop. Pathetic. The word came unbidden. Her mother's voice, her mother's judgment. Pathetic. She didn't try to get up. What was the point? Silas was out there, somewhere in the dark, dead already. Maybe, or dying, trampled under hooves. His bones breaking in the black mud just like hers were breaking now. And she was here, useless, helpless, unable to do anything except lie in the dirt and wait for news she didn't want to hear. Some adventure. Some grand escape from the life her mother had planned. She laughed. The sound came out ugly, a bark that got lost in the thunder and the rain. She didn't know how long she stayed there. Minutes, hours. Long enough for the cold to seep into her bones and settle there like it meant to stay. Long enough for the shaking to stop because her body had nothing left to shake with. Finally, she crawled back toward the porch, through the mud that tried to hold her down, up the steps on hands and knees, leaving dark smears on every board she touched, through the door she had left hanging open. She collapsed on the kitchen floor, didn't change clothes and didn't wash, just lay there on the floorboards, mud drying on her face and in her hair and between her fingers, staring at the ceiling while the storm raged on outside. The clock ticked. 4 o'clock. 5. Gray light crept through the windows. The rain had stopped. Clara couldn't remember when. The thunder had faded to distant rumbles. The wind had died to something almost like silence. She pushed herself up. Her whole body screamed. Her dress was stiff with dried mud, cracking when she moved. Her hair hung in matted ropes around her face. She walked to the porch, grabbed the quilt from the chair, wrapped it around her shoulders without caring about the mud she was smearing on it. The air outside smelled like wet sage and turned earth. Puddles filled every low spot in the yard. The mud was thick and dark, scarred with channels where the water had carved its paths. Clara stared at the northern horizon. Gray sky, gray land. Nothing moving. Minutes passed. The light grew stronger. Then movement. A shape in the mist, horse and rider. Moving slow, too slow. Clara was off the porch before she knew her legs had decided to run. Her bare feet, she had lost her boots somewhere in the night, slapped through puddles. Mud splashed up her legs. She didn't feel it. The shape became clearer. The bay mare, lathered and stumbling, and on her back, Silas, slumped forward over the horse's neck, hands tangled in the mane instead of holding the reins, not sitting, just clinging. Clara grabbed the bridle. The mare stopped, sides heaving, eyes rolling. Silas! He lifted his head. His face was gray beneath the dirt. His eyes barely focused. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. And underneath the torn fabric, she could see raw red skin glistening wet. He tried to dismount, swung one leg over, slid down the mare's side. His knees buckled the moment his boots touched ground. Clara caught him. His full weight slammed into her and nearly took her down into the mud again. She locked her knees, planted her feet, held on. He smelled like rain and sweat and horse and blood. "You're alive," she said. Her voice cracked on the second word. "You're alive." His forehead dropped against her shoulder. His whole body shook. For the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, Silas Drifter let himself be held. Clara half carried him across the yard. His arm hung heavy over her shoulders. His boots dragged through the mud, leaving twin furrows behind them. She couldn't feel her own legs anymore, just the weight of him pressing down. The strain in her lower back, the desperate need to keep moving forward. The porch steps were the hardest part. She took them one at a time. Silas tried to help, lifted his foot, set it down, lifted again. His hand gripped her shoulder, hard enough to leave bruises. They made it inside. He lowered him into the chair by the stove. His head fell back against the wooden slats. His eyes closed. His chest heaved with each ragged breath. Clara didn't stop to think. She pulled off his wet coat, fighting with sleeves that had plastered themselves to his arms like a second skin. His shirt underneath was soaked through, torn at the shoulder where she had seen the raw flesh glistening. She unbuttoned it with shaking fingers and peeled it away from his body. The rope burn was worse than she had thought. A stripe of red and purple ran from his shoulder down across his chest, the mark of a lariat wrapped too tight, pulled too hard against desperate weight. Blisters had formed along the edges and burst. Some of the skin had torn away entirely, leaving raw patches that wept clear fluid. His hands were worse. She turned them over in her grip and felt her stomach clench. The palms looked like meat. Raw, bloody, the skin had been stripped away in patches, leaving exposed flesh that was already starting to swell. Clara grabbed the wool blanket from the bedroom, wrapped it around his shoulders, stoked the fire until the cast-iron stove glowed red, and heat poured into the room in waves. Then she pumped water into the basin, heated it on the stovetop, found the cleanest cloth she could. She washed his hands first. He didn't make a sound. His jaw clenched when the warm water hit the raw flesh. She saw the muscles jump beneath the stubble, but he didn't pull away. She cleaned the dirt and the dried blood and whatever else had crusted there during the long night. Then she tore strips from her own petticoat and wrapped them around his palms, tight enough to stay in place, loose enough to let the wounds breathe. The chest wound came next. She worked the same way, slow, careful, thorough. The skin was hot to the touch, angry red at the edges, but there was no sign of infection. Not yet. When she finished, she made coffee, strong, black. The way he drank it, she pressed the cup into his bandaged hands and watched him take the first sip. Color started coming back to his face. The gray faded to something more human. His breathing slowed, steadied. Clara pulled the other chair close and sat down across from him. Her dress was still stiff with dried mud. Her hair hung in matted clumps. She hadn't washed, hadn't changed, hadn't done anything except focus on keeping him alive. "Biscuits," she said. "I should make biscuits. You need to eat something." "Stay," one word, but the way he said it stopped her cold. She sat back down. Silas looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. His eyes were clearer now, focused. He took another sip, set the cup on his knee, cradling it in his bandaged palms. "You look like you wrestled a pig," he said. Clara let out a sound half laugh. half sob. I fell off the porch, into the mud. Why, I was... She stopped. Her throat tightened, started again. I was scared. I thought you weren't coming back. I thought... She couldn't finish. The words wouldn't come. Silas nodded, like that was answer enough. Like he understood everything she couldn't say. He drank more coffee. Clara watched his throat move when he swallowed. Watched the steam rise between his bandaged hands. Waited. Found him in the canyon, he said finally. His voice was rough, scraped thin. Already running when I got there. Lightning had him spooked bad. 300 head moving like one animal, all of them blind with fear. Clara didn't speak. Didn't want to interrupt. This was more words than he had strung together in all the weeks since she had arrived. Rode into the middle of 'em. He shook his head slowly. Coat off, waving it over my head, yelling, trying to turn the lead steers before they hit the valley floor. He paused, stared at a spot on the floor between his boots. They didn't want to turn. Kept pushing south, toward the ranches, and toward the farms, toward... He stopped, swallowed, toward here. Clara's hands gripped the seat of her chair. The wood dug into her palms. Got ahead of him, finally. The mare knows that country pa trained her mother on those same trails. She found a way through a side canyon, got us in front of the herd, pushed the leaders east. The rest followed. He looked up at her. Herd animals, they do that. Follow the ones in front. Even into nowhere. Even into empty land where there's nothing to destroy. How long? Hours. Don't know how many. Lost count after the first few. He looked down at his bandaged hands. Horse stumbled once. Went down hard on her front knees. Eye rolled clear. Hooves missed my head by... He held up 2 fingers, close together. That much. Maybe less. Clara's stomach turned over. Got back on. Kept going. He said it like he was describing mending a fence. Flat, factual. Storm broke around dawn. Herd settled in the basin. Tired, scared, but settled. He took another sip of coffee. Rode back, and that's all. That's all. Like it was nothing. Like he hadn't ridden alone into a stampede in the dark. Like he hadn't nearly died under the hooves of 300 wild cattle. You could have died, Clara said. He nodded. Why? The question hung in the air between them. Silas didn't answer right away. He stared at a spot past her shoulder, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite swallow. Somebody had to, he said finally. That's not an answer. It's the only one I got. No. Clara's voice came out harder than she intended. Sharp. You rode into a stampede, alone, in a storm, for people who barely know your name. Why? Silas set down his coffee cup. His bandaged hands rested on his knees. He looked at her, really looked, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not fear, not pride. Something quieter. Something that had been there all along, buried under the silence. Pa used to say, he stopped, started again. You protect what's yours, even if it costs you. A pause. Especially if it costs you. But those people aren't yours. The Holloways, the Fentons, the rest of them. They're just neighbors. Neighbors is what I got. He looked down at his hands again. Had, for 3 years, neighbors in this land and nothing else worth counting. Clara stood up. Her legs were stiff. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. The dried mud on her dress cracked and flaked with every movement. She crossed the space between them, knelt beside his chair. The floor was hard against her knees. She didn't care. Silas. He looked down at her, waiting. I came here looking for something different, something that wasn't New York, wasn't my mother's plans, wasn't suitors with pretty words and empty promises. She took a breath, let it out. I thought I wanted a man from a storybook, someone who would sweep me off my feet with grand gestures and fine speeches. His face didn't change, he just listened. That's not what I found. Her voice shook. She let it. I found a man who makes coffee before I wake up, who hangs curtains crooked because he never learned to sew but tried anyway. Who reads the Bible out loud to a sick woman for 4 days because he doesn't know what else to do? Her hand found his, bandaged palm against calloused fingers. I found a man who rides into a stampede for neighbors, who nearly dies for strangers, who does what needs doing and never asks for thanks. Silas's breath caught. I'm not going back to New York, Clara said. I'm not leaving. I'm staying here not as some arrangement, not as a name on a piece of paper, as your wife, for real, if you have me. He didn't answer with words. His hand moved slow, uncertain, and came to rest on her hair. Light as a bird landing. His fingers trembled against her scalp. She leaned into the touch, closed her eyes. When she opened them again, his face was wet. She had never seen him cry, hadn't thought he could. You scared me half to death, she whispered. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. Only half. The other half was too angry to be scared. Now he did smile, small, fragile, like something that hadn't been used in years. Clara rose from her knees, sat on the arm of his chair. His arm went around her waist, careful of his wounds, careful of her weight. She leaned against his shoulder. They stayed like that while the fire burned low, while the morning light strengthened through the crooked curtains, while the world outside slowly dried and warmed and came back to life. Clara. I ain't good with words. Never have been. Probably never will be. I know. But He stopped, swallowed hard. I'm glad you stayed. She turned her head, pressed her lips against his temple, tasted salt and dirt, and something underneath that was just him. So am I. Outside, the sound of wagon wheels on the muddy track, voices calling, horses snorting. The neighbors were coming. 2 weeks later, the wagons started arriving at dawn. Clara counted them from the porch. 1, 2, 5, 8. They rolled up the muddy track in a slow procession, wheels cutting fresh ruts in the soft earth. Men sat on the benches with tools across their laps, hammers, saws, levels, coils of rope. Women rode beside them with baskets covered in checkered cloth. Martha Holloway's wagon came first. She climbed down before Ezra had fully stopped the horses and marched across the yard like a general surveying a battlefield. Well, she said, looking at the small ranch house, the weathered barn, the fence line that still needed mending. We got work to do. Clara stood on the porch in her cleanest dress, the dove gray one with the mother-of-pearl buttons, washed and pressed. The mud finally scrubbed from the hem. I don't understand. What is all this house-raising? Atta's eyes crinkled at the corners. Ezra told folks what your husband did, riding into that stampede alone, turning 300 head in the dark. She shook her head slowly. Word spread fast. Folks wanted to do something, but we didn't ask. Of course you didn't. And that man wouldn't ask for a glass of water if he was dying of thirst in the desert. Martha patted Clara's arm. That's why we didn't wait to be asked. The men unloaded lumber from the wagons, fresh-cut boards, still smelling of pine sap and sawdust. They carried them to a patch of level ground 50 yards from the old house, a spot Clara hadn't paid much attention to before. Good drainage, full morning sun, room to grow. Silas emerged from the barn. His hands were still wrapped in bandages, though the wounds had finally closed enough that he could grip a hammer without wincing. He stopped at the edge of the yard and stared at the growing pile of lumber, at the men setting up sawhorses, at the women spreading blankets in the shade of the cottonwood tree. Ezra Holloway walked over to him, put one weathered hand on Silas's shoulder, said something Clara couldn't hear from the porch. Silas shook his head. Ezra said something else. Silas shook his head again. Then Ezra pressed a hammer into his bandaged hands, pointed at the lumber pile, walked away without waiting for an answer. Silas stood there for a long moment. The hammer hung at his side, his jaw worked, his shoulders were tight. Then he walked to the lumber pile and started sorting boards. Clara watched from the porch, watched the men gather around him, not waiting for instructions, just falling into place like they'd done this 100 times before. Watched them take his lead. This board here, that beam there, the frame rising piece by piece under his direction. He didn't talk much, pointed, dotted, shook his head when something wasn't right. But they followed anyway. They listened to his silences the same way Clara had learned to listen. By noon, the skeleton of a house stood against the blue sky. 4 walls, no roof yet, no windows, just the bones of something that would become real. The fresh pine caught the sunlight and glowed pale gold against the darker hills beyond. Martha appeared at Clara's elbow with a cup of water. Told you? Stand next to him long enough. He'll fix himself. Clara took the cup, drank. The water was cool and clean. I think maybe we fixed each other. Martha smiled. The lines around her eyes deepened into familiar grooves. Well, that's how it's supposed to work, ain't it? The sun dropped toward the western hills. The men kept working, younger ones on the frame, older ones directing traffic. Everyone moving with the easy rhythm of people who had done this before and would do it again. Clara helped the women set out food on the long tables. Someone had assembled from sawhorses and spare planks. Fried chicken, biscuits, beans. 3 different pies that Mrs. Patterson had somehow produced, despite never sharing her recipe with anyone. Clara carried a plate to Silas, where he stood near the half-built wall, checking the level of a crossbeam with a practiced eye. He took the plate without speaking, ate standing up, the food disappearing in quick, efficient bites, handed the empty plate back to her. Good chicken, he said. Mrs. Patterson made it. Figures. That was all, but his hand brushed hers, when he returned the plate. His fingers lingered for half a second, callus against callus, rough skin against rough skin. Then he turned back to the crossbeam and picked up his hammer. The neighbors left at dusk. Wagon wheels creaked down the track. Voices called goodbye across the darkening yard. Lanterns bobbed in the gathering twilight like fireflies drifting toward home. Clara stood in what would become the parlor. The frame rose around her raw wood, fresh cut, smelling of pine and possibility. No walls yet, no roof, just the shape of rooms taking form from nothing. She walked through them slowly, her boots quiet on the packed dirt floor. This would be the kitchen. She could tell by the extra supports for the heavy stove they would need. This the bedroom larger than the old one. Room for a proper bed instead of the narrow cot she had been sleeping on. She stopped in a smaller space off the main room. 4 walls roughed in, one window opening facing east, where the morning light would come. Just big enough for a cradle, a rocking chair, things that might come later, footsteps behind her. She knew the sound of his boots by now. Silas stopped in the doorway, his bandaged hands hung at his sides. He looked at the small room, at Clara standing in the middle of it with her hand resting on the rough-cut frame. Thinking, he asked. Imagining. He nodded, looked around at the bare frame, the exposed beams, the sky showing through where the roof would go. Needs work. Everything does. His mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but closer than she had seen in weeks. Closer than she had ever expected to see. He crossed the space between them. His hand found hers. Their fingers interlaced his rough and bandaged, hers calloused now from weeks of work that would have made her mother faint. They stood in the skeleton of their future and didn't say anything at all. The words weren't necessary anymore. The old house felt smaller now that Clara had walked through the frame of the new one. Smaller, but not sad. Just ready to become something else, a storage shed. Maybe. Or a place for hired hands, if they ever had any. She sat on the porch with Silas, their backs against the weathered boards, their faces turned toward the new frame standing pale in the moonlight. The night was cool. Stars scattered across the black sky like salt spilled on a dark tablecloth. Clara reached into her pocket, pulled out an envelope, set it on her knee. Silas looked at it. What's that? Money. From New York. I brought it when I came. She turned the envelope over in her hand. The paper was soft now, worn from handling. Emergency fund. In case things didn't work out. In case I needed to run back home. He didn't say anything. Just waited. I want to use it for the roof. Windows. Whatever else we need. She held out the envelope. For us. He looked at the envelope. Back at her face. The moonlight caught his eyes and held them. That's yours? It was. She pressed it into his bandaged hands. Now it's ours. He held the envelope for a long moment, didn't open it, didn't count the bills inside, just held it like it weighed more than paper and ink. Then he set it on the porch rail beside him and put his arm around her shoulders. Clara leaned into him, felt the solid warmth of his body against hers, smelled wood smoke and sweat, and something underneath that was just him, familiar now, after all these weeks, familiar and good. A coyote called somewhere in the dark hills, high and lonesome. Another answered from farther away. Clara? I'm glad you stayed. She tilted her head against his shoulder. I'm glad you gave me something to stay for. Silence. The good kind, the kind that held things instead of hiding them. I'm still not much for talking, he said after a while. I know. Probably won't ever change. I know that too. You all right with that? Clara looked up at him. The moonlight caught his face, the strong jaw, the weathered skin, the eyes that had learned to say what his mouth couldn't. Tired, worn, hers. Turns out I'm learning a new language. His arm tightened around her shoulders. And I'm still a terrible cook, she added. Biscuits are getting better. That's not saying much. Pause. Long enough for another coyote to call in the distance. No, he said. It ain't. She laughed. The sound surprised her how easy it came, how natural it felt. He made a noise that might have been a laugh too, rusty and unpracticed, like machinery that hadn't been used in years. They sat there on the porch of the old house and watched the moonlight fall on the bones of the new one. Tomorrow there would be more work, more neighbors arriving with lumber and nails, more walls going up, more rooms taking shape. The roof would come, then the windows, then everything else, a home built board by board, day by day, by hands that had finally learned to work together. But tonight, there was only this. Two people who had found each other in the silence, who had learned to speak without words, who had built something neither of them had expected when she stepped off that stagecoach into the dust of Sagebrush Hollow. Clara's head came to rest on his shoulder. His chin settled on her hair. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Sometimes a story settles in a quiet place somewhere between the chest and the throat, and stays there for a while. This one might do that. The image of two people sitting on a porch in the moonlight, watching the frame of a house they'll build together. The weight of words that were never spoken, but somehow said everything that mattered. Many of us have known that kind of silence, the kind that isn't empty, but full. We've stood beside someone and understood that love doesn't always arrive the way we expected, with grand gestures and pretty speeches. Sometimes it shows up in coffee left warming on the stove, in curtains hung crooked but hung with care, in hands that reach across a table in the dark. Perhaps you've carried something like that yourself. A love that didn't announce itself. A moment when you realized the person beside you had been speaking all along, just in a language you hadn't learned yet. It's all right to let this story rest now. It doesn't need to be anything more than what it was. A quiet tale about two people who found each other in the silence between words. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying until the end.